out your wallets. You know what that sound means. It is time for Breaking the Piggy Bank. This is Watchdog.org's weekly look at public pension issues. And this week we're going to be looking at specifically some of the gimmicks that are played with our public pensions and how those gimmicks are helping to break the piggy bank and break many state budgets as well. My normal co-host Steve Greenhut will be joining us in just a little bit. But first we've got a special guest on the program. This is Joe Lupino Esposito. He's the editor and general counsel for StateBudgetSolutions.org, and they've got a new report out this week taking a look at these pension gimmicks that are played from coast to coast. Different gimmicks in different states, but all of them are bad news for taxpayers and for state budgets. Joe, thanks so much for being here. I guess let's just take it off the top. What's the purpose behind this report? What is State Budget Solutions looking at here, and how serious is this problem of budget and pension gimmicks in state budgets?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. What we do every year is we actually take a look at a few different things. We deal with state budget issues, obviously, and in particular the things that weigh the heaviest on state budgets. And, of course, probably chief among those are pensions. And we used to look at just budget gimmicks in general, and we had a few of those elements included some of these pension gimmicks. But what we realized is that there are so many different gimmicks going on, and there are so many that folks don't know about, that we thought it was worth doing its own report, sort of an independent resource for citizens and even policymakers to take a look at and say, here's what we can do to fix some of these problems. Or if you see some politician promising that they're going to fix something with, say, a pension obligation bond, you know what that really means. And that's what we try to do here.
Yeah, and we'll get into pension obligation bonds in just a second, but I think, you guys do great work. State budgets and state pensions, we talk about this on this program every single week, about the intersection between the two and how these pension plans in most states are really the biggest problem. The increase in costs that states are facing pretty much every single year are the single biggest problem in state budgets. Let's talk about some of the questionable maneuvers, some of the gimmicks, as you guys say, that states are using. You already mentioned pension obligation bonds, so maybe we should start there. Kansas recently approved a big pension obligation bond. It was in the news. They're not the first state to do this. Cities have been making mistakes with these types of bonds for years. Tell us a little bit about how a pension obligation bond works and why, more often than not, it doesn't work.
Right. So the idea is, and it makes some sense on an intellectual level, that what you're going to do is you're going to take out a bond based on what you're going to owe into the pension system. And then you'll borrow against that now in order to invest that money, and therefore you'll have greater returns later. And especially in a time like we are now where interest rates are so low, hypothetically, your bond repayment and interest rates for that should be much lower than you'll make in the stock market, because most of these funds are assuming a rate of 7 to 8%, and if they're looking at the last couple of years, they're looking at 10% plus per year gains. So this only works, though, for a limited amount of time, because there's a few things that happen when they do this. The first thing, which is sort of another gimmick in itself, is that they lower the contribution to the pension fund for that year, because they're saying, look, we're going to have more money in the future because of this bond, so therefore we can put in less today. So that puts them in a hole sort of earlier. And then when inevitably, even if the stock market does do what it's expected to do, quote unquote, they will still have issues with other liabilities that continue to grow, because they also don't consider the discount rate, which, again, another gimmick, is another way they look at the liabilities down the road. And they don't consider those numbers to be inaccurate, and therefore they'll have a problem with those liabilities. So even if all goes right, you're going to still have a problem, because there's going to be some element that will not work 100%. And when you're dealing with this amount of money, even if you're off at, say, 95%, 95% of everything you do works, you're still going to have a serious problem.
Yeah, the idea essentially being, and there was a lot there to unpack, but the idea essentially being that you're going to trade high interest rate debt that is in the retirement system now for lower interest rate debt, and hey, you save some money in the long run. The first thing you mentioned there, though, of the potential problems there and the potential gimmicks is that you put the bond money into the pension system, and all of a sudden a pension system that was deep in debt and looked like it was in serious trouble and needed to be fixed, all of a sudden it doesn't look like it's in as bad a shape anymore. Really all you've done is transfer the debt out of the pension system and into the general fund or the general obligations that the state has. You haven't really dealt with that debt, and you certainly haven't dealt with the underlying problems that put you in the hole in the first place. So it kind of glosses over a bad situation, makes it look better, and then that leads to maybe some political mistakes like handing out benefit increases or just failing to address the underlying problems, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's amazing how short everyone's memory becomes. In the ensuing few years, they seem to have forgotten that the reason why they suddenly look flush with cash is because they went into great debt to do it. So you're absolutely right. A few years down the road, you'll see everyone demanding higher raises because, look, the pension fund is doing just fine because they front-loaded some of this cash. This, again, like you said, does not solve the problem.
Yeah, no, I'm originally from Pennsylvania. Philadelphia went through one of these things in the 90s. They got a pension obligation bond, more than $1 billion, dumped it in there. The assumptions that they were using ended up not working out, as you were saying. They got most of the things right, but they got a few things wrong, and then they also handed out benefit increases to their public employees shortly thereafter. Anyway, long story short, Philadelphia ended up owing as much money in the pension system 10 years later as they had owed when they did the bond, but then they also had the bond debt on top of that, so they ended up with a double whammy for taxpayers there. This isn't just theoretical stuff. This is, in reality, we've seen cities make these mistakes. We've seen some states go down a road and end up in some very bad situations because of these pension obligation bonds. But let's talk about some of the other stuff in the report. Joe, what other sorts of gimmicks are there? You mentioned discount rate earlier. That's one of those phrases that makes people's eyes kind of glaze over. Try, as simple as you can. Yeah. What is a discount rate, and how are states playing games with that?
Yeah, the way I like to describe the discount rate is essentially, most people are familiar with the concept of compounding interest, right? And you know that if you have a certain amount of money today, if there's a certain interest rate, that's how much money you'll have tomorrow or X amount of years down the road. Discount rates are essentially the reverse. They know if they need X amount of dollars in the future to pay off these liabilities, and therefore, how much money do we need today? Of course, the problem with this is that most of these funds are assuming 7 to 8% returns year over year. That also assumes that all of the contributions are put in full. And you see states like New Jersey have had that issue where they still are assuming the high rate of return, but they're not putting in the same amount of money that they're supposed to be putting in. So not only are you shortchanging it in the short term, but now that's the 8% the multiplier that is not happening either. So that's sort of the biggest issue when you talk about the discount rates. What we advocate for is something that we call a market-based valuation. And what we do is we look at the actual value of the liabilities, not the value of the potential investments. When you do that, what you find is that because these liabilities in almost all states and in cities and really almost any government entity, these are required payouts, these pension benefits. These are essentially the same, or at least very close to, what we consider government bond payouts. They're just about as safe of an investment as you can get. So if that's what we have in mind, that's sort of our model for what the liability is all about, that's what we should be basing the discount rate on. So, of course, by our numbers, especially with the really hurting yields on U.S. Treasury bonds right now, we're looking at a return rate between 2.5% and 3%. They're looking at 8%. And this is where we have such a big discrepancy from what most states put out. But even that said, I mean, our liability, when we take all of the states combined, correcting for what we see as the appropriate discount rate, is about $4.7 trillion. Now, if you take all of their own numbers, they still put themselves at about $1 trillion. So it's not like they're doing well even by their own numbers. So either way, there's a problem, but they keep doing these gimmicks anyway.
Yeah, and that means even if they hit that 7.5% or 8%, it's, different states have different projections, but even if they hit that number every year from now for the next 30, 50 years, there's still going to be $1 trillion in debt. And what you guys are saying is essentially, no, you're not going to get that number. You're not going to get close to that number, or at least you shouldn't expect it. And then if you do, hey, that's great. If you get 7.5%, fantastic, but don't bet on it. Bet on 3.5%, bet on 3%. It's a more realistic rate of return. You know you're going to obtain that every year. You're going to hit that target without having to go after any risky investments, basically just investing in bonds. You're going to come close to that number. And then anything you get on top of it is gravy. And hey, that's good news for taxpayers, as opposed to the current situation where every year that you come up short of that $1 trillion, maybe it's $4 trillion, whatever, that $1 trillion hole ends up just just getting deeper and deeper. And then there's the associated thing. We could talk about this for a long time, but there's the associated risk of, if the pension funds have to hit that higher percentage, they're chasing riskier and riskier investments to do it. And that means, hey, good years are better, but it means bad years are worse because those investments are more volatile. We don't want to get too off down on that path because that's a whole nother thing. We're talking with Joe Espino Esposito. He is the editor and general counsel for State Budget Solutions. New report that they have out on statebudgetsolutions.org looking at pension gimmicks and state budgetary gimmicks. And, of course, those two things so often very similar. Joe, just a few minutes left here. We've talked a little bit about pension bonds. We've talked a bit about discount rates. If anybody wants to go look at the full report and really dig into this thing, they could look at, you talk about overly aggressive assumptions, which we already kind of touched on. They could learn about rolling amortization and smoothing and all sorts of other financial tricks that are played. But one that really jumped out to me, and right at the top of your report here, is talking about outdated life expectancy assumptions. And we're going to have Steve Greenhut here in just a few minutes. He's from out in California, and you talk specifically in your report about how California is doing this. What are we just assuming that people are going to die at age 50 like they used to 100 years ago? What does this mean exactly, and how is this a gimmick in the pension systems?
Yeah, this is, it's not quite that bad, but it's close. It's essentially what they're doing is that they're taking an assumption, a few different oddball assumptions. Some are that they just haven't updated that number in many years. So you're looking at something where they may have a life expectancy of, say, 70, where, on average it's a lot closer to 80. So that's 10 more years of a liability of someone that, if they put in 20 to 30 years, they might be making six figures, and they might be making six figures even, on a pension benefit. So they're also not considering as medical advances go on, that life expectancy sort of keeps going up time and time again. So these are some things that should be updated more frequently, and they're just simply not updated. And then, oddly enough, like we've seen in California, they've considered that police and fire personnel are more likely to die on the job. Now, this is sort of like, yes, they're dangerous positions, and seems like almost a common sense type of assumption. But the numbers don't bear that out. And in fact, in some states, we found that fire and police are actually some of the safest jobs if you're talking about mortality on the job. And then other ways states can twist this is that they also include things like heart attacks and dying on the job that way. So it's not just sort of occupational hazards. So there's a lot of fumbling around to make this make a lot of sense, and for them to say, look, people are not going to live as long as we think they're going to live. And therefore, again, when it comes to the contribution rates, we can put in less contributions now because we've figured these out incorrectly.
So this is a bit morbid, perhaps, but essentially what they're saying is we can underfund the pensions. It's fine because we know a bunch of our cops and firefighters are going to die, and that's going to be very sad. And we'll have parades, and everybody will be very sad. But hey, it'll fix our pension problem, right? Is that essentially what the state budget makers are saying?
Right, that's exactly what they're saying. They're just saying, let's go with this assumption, and we're not going to really mention it to anybody, and that just allows us to put in whatever amount of money we want.
Yeah, so they are making those assumptions about when the cops are going to die or when the firefighters are going to die, but they maybe not taking into consideration the actual reality that these are not some of the most dangerous jobs in the world. That is unfortunately all the time we have for you today, Joe. Really appreciate it, though. That's Joe Lupino Esposito. He's the editor and general counsel from State Budget Solutions. You can check out their new report looking at pension gimmicks in state budgets. That's at statebudgetsolutions.org. So, Joe, we really appreciate you being here today. I want to say goodbye to him and hello to our other guest, my usual co-host, Steve Greenhut. He joins us now from California. And, Steve, we were just talking about, Joe was just here telling us about this in California, the CalPERS system in particular, some questions that State Budget Solutions is raising about whether CalPERS is really using the right estimations, the right projections when it comes to how long public workers are going to live, and the consequences there being, of course, if you're making a $100,000 pension, and that's not unheard of, as you know, certainly better than I do out there in California, $100,000 pension, you live 10 years longer than they think you will. That's an extra $1 million, and $1 million here and $1 million there. Sooner or later, we're talking about real money.
It's not their problem, it's the taxpayers'